went to a class on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Wow.
I mean, it's hard to pick up in the middle. I might take it next semester. I mean, it's so up over there. And no one knows who started it.
The most volatile and convoluted discussion in the world right now is the debate over the history of the Holy Land. And one aspect of that debate is the question, which of the two groups has the stronger claim to the land? Well, what makes it such an impossible dilemma is that many people on one side of the issue declare that the land is theirs entirely, and the other group has no claim at all to the land, and they need to leave. Take a look.
Would you be willing to share the land equally with the Jews for peace?
Of course not.
Why?
That's our land. Something for me, I don't like to share it, especially when it comes by force.
Would you share the land equally with the Jews if there was peace?
I don't think so.
No?
No.
Why?
Because for some reasons, they are not in their country. It's our country, to be honest. That's why.
Would you share the land equally with Jews for peace?
Of course not.
Why not?
This is our land. Yeah, this is the Palestinians' land, so this is not a question to be asked. Actually, this is our own land, so we can't share it with other people who came from other countries.
Normally, I steer clear of those kind of talks, but this part of the argument actually got me thinking and wondering more about the background of the conflict. Who truly has the stronger claim to the land? And incidentally, there's this reference to Mark Twain with regard to Palestine that kept coming up, and it piqued my interest. It seemed like such an oddity that I felt the need to look into it. I thought, maybe he can help. So I purchased a copy of The Innocents Abroad. It's one of Mark Twain's nonfiction works, and it's a book of his travel writings from his trips to Europe and the Middle East. 120 pages worth of this book take place during Mark Twain's time exploring Palestine, and as it happens, he was there in the year 1869. I mention the year because the Zionist movement, or the push for Jews to populate the Holy Land, that didn't happen until the year 1881. So Mark Twain is eyewitness to Palestine prior to the State of Israel, which puts him in a pretty good position to tell who was there and what the place was like. Mark Twain visited all the famous biblical sites: Galilee, Capernaum, Tiberias, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Jericho, Shechem. And according to the author, Palestine in the 19th century was not a thriving or bustling or flourishing territory. The first thing you notice in his writing was that the places were dreary. It was dreary and run down, and there was very little cultivation of the land. Here's how he describes the landscape. Hardly any trees, grass, or flowers. It was mostly barren rocky hills and flat burning deserts. There were some crumbling Roman ruins and occasionally beautiful mosques and Catholic churches, but the vast majority of the geography and the infrastructure was lifeless and unimpressive, especially compared with the spectacular Bible stories associated with the land. Now, what about the people Mark Twain encountered? Well, one of the more striking details of his account was how few people they saw at times. There were long stretches of travel in which they saw hardly anyone at all. Maybe a handful of Arabs or Bedouin goat herders, or sometimes nobody. So the word desolation occurs so often in Mark Twain's writing because so much of the land was just emptiness. But there were some densely populated towns and villages where he witnessed a great deal of poverty and squalor and disease. One of the descriptors that the author uses is squalid humanity. His words, not mine. But he saw a lot of Arabs with wounds and sores and disabilities, and he watched malnourished kids walking around with their faces covered in flies. And unsurprisingly, it was not a happy, friendly place. Spots like Tiberias and Jerusalem, there were mobs of aggressive beggars who would block his path and yell at him until he paid them or tipped them something. In fact, these places were so unpleasant that Mark Twain said it felt like he was back in biblical times. It was reminiscent of the ancient world. So the implication is that Palestine in the 19th century, under the administration of the Ottoman Turks, was just not a very coveted or desirable place. And what's more, at no point is any group of people referred to as Palestinians. There's plenty of mention of Arabs, Jews, Bedouins, Catholics. Never is the label Palestinian used. I think that informs the question as to who was the first to arrive in the land. I'm willing to revise my opinion here, but at this point in time, I think Mark Twain was a credible primary source. He didn't have a reputation for being a liar. There's no evidence he was biased toward the State of Israel because it didn't exist. And there were other writers from that period who also attested to the same sorts of things.
He describes Palestine, I'm quoting him, is a vast wasteland. He said, only imagination can grace this barren land with the pomp of circumstance and life. It's just, he said, we traveled for a whole day. We didn't see, in the Galilee, we didn't see a human being, one single human being. He said, Jerusalem sits in sackcloth and ashes. And he says, I looked south and I looked north. He says, I'm in Judea. And I see nothing. He says, a barren expanse. And they both express, both Twain and Arthur Penryn Stanley say the same thing. When will the Jews come back and bring this land to life?
There's another author who's useful here, and it's an historian called Abram Sachar. Abram Sachar wrote a book called A History of the Jews, which seems to corroborate Mark Twain's observations. Sachar's book contains the explanation for how the Zionist immigrants converted Palestine into a modern and highly civilized commonwealth. He makes the case that the increase in Jews correlated with an increase in Arabs, and all of which began to enjoy a higher standard of living. Meanwhile, in the surrounding countries, the Arab population and the Arab well-being seem to remain static.
If you will it, it is no dream.
Fucking 20 minutes late, man. What the f*** is that?
Theodore Herzl.
Huh?
State of Israel. If you will it, dude, it is no dream.
What the fuck?
First of all, the soil there was parched and diseased, and the Jewish settlers had to nurse it back to health. Only then could they cultivate orchards, vineyards, almond plantations, wheat fields. They used the Jordan River for irrigation, and they tapped the Dead Sea for minerals, which up until that point had to be imported. For a long time, amoebic dysentery and tuberculosis had been a problem in the Arab villages, but Jewish people brought modern medicine, and they built hospitals and nurseries, and they improved health standards all around. Also, the Jews built infrastructure. They created thriving towns like Haifa and Tel Aviv, places that were previously just sand dunes and swamps. And they did all that while being violently opposed by Arabs and stifled by the British. There's no question that both Jews and Palestinians have some historical claim to the land, but I think it's important to mention that the Zionist Jewish immigrants were not colonizers. They were pioneers. And they added value to the place, and they created a pretty good society there. If you found anything useful in this video, thanks for watching. If you didn't like it, I'm sorry I wasted your time.